Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. This is Jay from Coding with Jaybird, where I upload weekly tutorials to help build your confidence in coding. Today we're going to look at JavaScript functions. What do they mean? How do we write them? How do they work? Let's start coding. For today's video, I've created a JS Functions folder here on my desktop. Now let's go ahead and open that in VS Code. Now inside this folder, I've created a functions.html file, which is referencing a main.js file in the JS folder. And I've also linked a styles.css file, which has some minimal styling. So this is running here in the live server on the right. Now let's get started with the actual JavaScript logic. So what is a function? A function is a block of code or set of statements that do some calculations or do some other task. Now functions are reusable bits of code that receive some input and return an output. A function can only be used in the scope in which it is defined. If it's defined in the global scope, it can only be used globally. Now let's have a look at what a function looks like. So the first thing we must do is we must declare a function. There are several ways to define or declare a function. The most common is by using the function keyword, followed by the name and parentheses, like this. Then we wrap the code which we plan to execute in curly braces. When naming a function, we must follow the same rules as naming a variable in JavaScript. So let's create a function and we'll just call this welcome message. And I'll follow this with round brackets. And then after this, we have our curly braces. Now our logic for the function goes in here. So I'm just going to display something in the console. And I'll keep it simple. We'll just say welcome to this JavaScript tutorial. And when I save this, oh, we don't see anything in the console. So why is that? Well, this function won't run, meaning it won't do anything unless it's called. So the next thing we must do is we must call the function. A function can be invoked or called from somewhere in the JavaScript code itself, or by a user event, or automatically, meaning it's self-invoked. Now we're going to call it from the code, and we call it by referencing its name. So I'll reference welcome message, and then follow this with the round brackets and semicolon. And when I save this, we see our message in the console. So let's have a look at parameters. Now functions can receive arguments, which are then used as parameters in the function itself. Parameters are names that we list inside of the function definitions, round brackets. So if I have a function called full name, and this function has two parameters, first name, last name. Now inside the curly brackets, we're going to have the logic. So all I want to do is display a message in the console. So my student's name is, and I'm just going to concatenate a few things. Now, first name. What's going to go in first name? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's just write this out. So what I've done here is I've created this function, full name, and what we're going to do is when we call this function, so full name, we're going to pass in two arguments. So we're going to pass in whatever the function is expecting. Now the function is expecting to get a first name and a last name. So those will be string values. And I'll pass in Matthew. And for the last name, Jameson. So what's happening is here, we're passing in an argument. Now arguments are the actual values that are passed into the function. So at the point that we call this function, we have Matthew Jameson going into this full name function, and first name will take on the value of Matthew, and last name will take on the value of Jameson. Now, first name and last name are only available for use as variables within the scope of this function. So if I were to call first name outside of line 14 and 16, it wouldn't work. But in line 15, I simply say my student's name is, and I can concatenate first name, which is replaced with Matthew, and last name, which is replaced with Jameson. Now functions also have return statements. Up until now, we've seen functions that do something by displaying a message in the console. A function always does something. Now functions usually have return statements. So a return statement is when the function stops executing and returns something, usually a value, back to where the function was called, meaning the caller. Because of this, the return statement must be the last line of the function. So let's create another function, and I'll call this function convert inches to cent. And this function is just going to do some simple multiplication. So I'll receive a length, which will be a length parameter in the function. And then I want to return whatever that value is, length times 2.54, because that's a conversion from inches to centimeters. So when I call the function convert inches to cent, I'm going to pass in a value, let's say 1. So 1 inch will be passed in as an argument. This argument will be received here in the function itself, and length will store the value of 1. Then the function will return 1 times 2.54, which we should see here. Now, if I save this, we don't see anything in the console, and that's because we haven't displayed this. So return is not automatically going to alert or log a message to the console. So we're going to need to either wrap it in an alert or some kind of console.log method to see the returned value. So we can do this by typing console.log and then just wrapping the caller inside of it. So convert inches to cent, and I'll pass in a different value this time so we can see the difference. And when I save this, you can see 15.24. So that's the centimeter equivalent of 6 inches. We can also store the value of the function in a variable. So I can have a variable, let a equals convert inches to cent, and I can pass in a value here. So here I could say, let's say maybe 10. And when I console.log a, I can see 25.4 centimeters. So I've stored the returned value from this function call inside of A, which we can see in this console log. Now we can also use the function directly as a variable value. So let maybe ruler length, let's say, equals a standard ruler is usually, and I'm just going to concatenate it with the function being called. So convert inches to cent, and I'll pass in 12 inches because most rulers are 12 inches plus centimeters long. Now let's console log this. And when I save this, you can see a standard ruler is usually 30.48 centimeters long. So we can see that we can actually call the function directly inside of a variable value. This is a short introduction to JavaScript functions. There are more modern ways of writing functions, which I will discuss in a future tutorial. For now, that's it for today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed watching my video. If you did, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Until next week, keep on coding.